Welcome to the Modise Network. On the show today, the NSFAS Administrator, Dr. Randall Carolissen, explains the scheme's efforts to stabilize student unrest at tertiary campuses. And later, Bishop Paul Verreyn shares ideas on how to heal the nation following the brutal murder of Carolissen. Several universities and TVET colleges got off to a volatile start of the 2019 academic year, with violence erupting and at least one student getting killed, property getting destroyed, and a good number of students getting arrested. At the center of the complaints is the implementation of the National Students Financial Assistance Scheme. The scheme assists tertiary students with funding allowances for tuition, books, and accommodation. The students complained about 12 issues that include their historic debt and financial exclusion. South Africa is into the second year of providing the nominally free tertiary education, which in itself is fraught with complications. To discuss the complexities of implementing NSFAS and the turmoil within the higher education sector, I'm joined by the Administrator, Dr. Randall Carolissen. And we're inviting you to join our discussion through your comments using the hashtag #TheModise Doc, pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
We appreciate, but the year was a very tumultuous one for you, with how many campuses that, you know?
Well, it's sporadic. It's all over the country that you have the sporadic outbursts of dissatisfaction and unrest, and as you rightly mentioned, also unfortunate death. And that speaks to a whole host of issues that we had to work through since my term of administration started. So first of all, there was a lot of unhappiness about the NSFAS not funding postgraduate studies. The accommodation issues that are bad and insufficient. You know, the interpretation of the allowance structure that we put in place. The unique challenges of rural students. There are simply no accommodation for rural students. So all of that provided quite a incendiary melting pot, if I can put it that way. But if you were to go back at the time of administration, so you know, sometimes people say you fix the plane's engine while you fly. I'm saying we're actually putting in an engine while we fly. If you look at what we inherited in August. So in August, when I arrived there, the systems were crashing every night. The data integrity was totally unreliable. That's per the AG report. Staff morale was down in the gutters. The NSFAS wasn't talking to the institutions. And students didn't get funded for a period up to 8 months. And all of that was very, very immediate burning platform issues we had to address.
Sure. Let's pause for a moment, because talk about it in an ABC kind of manner to make sense, because sometimes we talk about these things as if we all understand what we're talking about. Firstly, the Student Financial Assistance Scheme, what is the size of it? How much money are we talking about here?
This year, the budget is about 22 billion rand. And as more and more students of the previous regime gets phased out and more fee-free students are phased in, the budget will increase commensurately, in a commensurate fashion. So this year it will be about 30.3 billion rand, and next year about 37 billion rand. Now, within that budget framework, you have to then apply your rules and guidelines.
Right. Now, that's the fund. And then there's funding that goes to the institutions themselves, I would like to believe. I mean, the infrastructure, the salaries of the lecturers and administrators, that's a separate story altogether.
This is pure funding for students, their tuition and their, shall we call it, their allowances, their living and transport allowances.
And this goes direct to the students. It doesn't necessarily go to the institution.
That's interesting, because in the past, there was all sorts of channels that were used to get money to the students. And many of those channels erode value as it passed through the channel. So this year we took a very hard decision that we're going to get the money directly from the state, NSFAS, as quickly as possible and directly into the students' pockets. So we're now paying directly into students' bank account. It's a massive paradigm shift from the past, where students were driven into particular pockets and driven to particular outlets to use their money. And I personally have got a problem with that type of philosophy, because you breed then non-compliance behavior of students. So we know there was an underground trading of vouchers in East London, was very prevalent there. So for the first time, the big paradigm shift that we made is to pay students directly, because they're adults and we treat them like adults and we expect them to behave like adults.
Now, how different is NSFAS from, let's say, a bursary scheme?
So this is if for qualifying students, it is a bursary that is not refundable in cash terms, but there is a clause that says that we need to work back some of it, and that is yet to be implemented. So there is an obligation on students to put something back to the country, but that has not been fully developed, and we are working together with DHET on that.
Now, as I indicated, that we also have to differentiate between NSFAS and, I called it nominally free tertiary education. And I think I'm correct to say nominally, because it's not everybody who qualifies for whether either NSFAS or even this free tuition.
So one of the key issues that present us with lots of problems is exactly the two regimes that we have to administer. The pre-2018 regime and the post-2018 regime. The pre-2018 regime says the cutoff for eligibility is 122,000. Those are students currently in the system. The post, the cutoff is 350,000. And that in itself created an enormous amount of, shall we call it, conflict. Because the students that pre-2018, they were the ones that were in the Fees Must Fall campaign. And so it was difficult it's still difficult to administer that. But going forward, the funded students, the pre-2018 funded students will begin to phase out of the system, and then therefore only fully funded students will remain in the system. It's also instructive to note that in addition to the cutoff of 350,000, if you are a social grant beneficiary, you qualify automatically. There is no other checks that are done on you. And if you are a disabled student, the household income threshold is then 600,000. So there are all these accommodations that are made to make it accessible to students. Now just to give some statistics, and the more I work in the scheme, the more I'm convinced this is going to be the game changer for South Africa. Because last year we funded 707,000 students. Those are students that would not have been at university if it was not for the NSFAS scheme. So now we're bringing poor students that never would have had the opportunity into the university and offer them the opportunity to join, to become economically inclusive later in their lives, and hopefully also support their families. Now the challenge now remains, because some people seem to think that if you are a poor student, you are not very bright. I dispute that. So the challenge for institutions now is to make sure that those students are successful and put in place the necessary bridging and integration for those students to be successful at universities. Our preliminary research show that funded students are doing marginally better than unfunded students. It makes sense, because if you know where your next meal is going to come from, then you can concentrate on your study. If you have the dignity to buy new jeans and all of those things added together, you become a much more confident student.
So how much money are we talking about here per student, per year?
Well, at the moment, it varies from institution to institution, depending on the tuition structure. And so a student at WITS is costing us a lot more than a student, for instance, Walter Sisulu. And that's also one of the challenges that we are working towards, to find a way to begin to narrow that gap more, so that we have more equity across the system. So these are all the remaining challenges that we are working towards. But if we then talk about the 707,000 we funded last year, this year we're going to go to probably 800,000 by the looks of it, because we had a very successful marketing campaign to bring students into the system. And one of the early successes that we've registered, it's the first time ever students got allowances in February. The first time ever in the history of NSFAS, into their pocket and into their bank account. And in cases where institutions failed or were not able to do it, we developed a mechanism to actually pay directly from NSFAS into the student bank account.
But here's the thing, Doc, that the NSFAS, when it was introduced, it was meant to solve a problem, but somehow it has become the main problem within the higher education sector.
I actually disagree with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, every time we hear of student unrest, it's got to do with NSFAS than anything else, it appears.
I think NSFAS, the catchword has become quite attractive to throw into any type of conflict.
Yeah.
But not denying that there are not outstanding challenges. I mean, I can talk for hours about the outstanding challenges, about unreconciled student accounts, about students not being denied registration because the NSFAS records are not appropriate. So there remain serious challenges. But I think the first challenge that I described to you was the two regimes that we have to administer. That is really a flexing point. The second challenge is, without passing the buck, is the serious lack of decent and quality accommodation for students. And that's an infrastructural problem.
Which is now the university-specific problem, right?
And TVET.
And TVET colleges.
And TVET colleges.
Because this is where the institutions themselves have got to provide that infrastructure and the accommodation.
Of course, with the assistance of government. So there is, and our minister, I should compliment on this, he's done a lot to push additional funding into that space so that we can get decent and proper accommodation. There are interim measures that are being taken by institutions, and we work very closely with them on this because it's in our interest that our students are successful, is that we are working towards a system of accreditation. We are working towards a system for accreditation even for township accommodations, because we want this to also unlock economic opportunity for people that can invest in, residence for in a township environment.
And just to clarify the point of accreditation, meaning that the quality of the accommodation should meet certain standards.
Particular standards. So there should be a desk lamp, and you should have, all of those things. And the emphasis being that the student must live in an environment where he or she can realize their success.
Yes.
We don't want students to live in shacks and having to travel long distances, walk through gang-infested areas to get to university. So the rethink of the allowances that we did together with DHET took many progressive steps that were previously touted into account. So we accept now that we can't just pay for students that live beyond 10 kilometers. They could live 1 kilometer from the campus and still be very dangerous for them to get to the campus. So all of those steps have been extremely progressive to make sure that students get their funding in the first place at the right time and in a predictable way. Because we don't want students to get paid this month and they're not sure where they're going to get the next funding from. So we're building those platforms literally to make sure that there is predictability in the system and that NSFAS can disappear off the debate stage, because we should be able to fund. And what NSFAS should then do is to do the necessary research and modeling to make sure that our policies are appropriately structured to address the key problems of the country. So yes, NSFAS has got a long way to go. No, I don't want to deny that. But one should be careful to be very clear about what is in NSFAS control and not.
Let's look at the issues from the students' perspective, right? They reduced their concerns to about 12 key concerns. If you can just talk me through those.
So many of these concerns has got to do with policy. Okay, so students are saying, you fund us for undergraduate, why don't you fund us for postgraduate also? Now, NSFAS does not fund postgraduate. In certain circumstances, yes, but those are clearly defined. Postgraduate funding is in the NRF environment, or and other environments that should be coming from. So students are pushing for that. The second issue, we spoke at length about the accommodation. We spoke at length about the interpretation of the two regimes that we administer, the pre-2018 and post-2018. And then also, of course, the frustration that students have is the administrative issues that NSFAS are still working through. So, for instance, a student would have an unreconciled account, and accounts were never reconciled in NSFAS. It's only upon crisis that it got reconciled. We are now putting in place systems that will reconcile every month accounts. So a student might be owing money, and therefore he can't register because NSFAS is still reconciling the accounts. But we have found a mechanism where we publish those names and we gave it to institutions and say, if Mr. Modise arrives at your doorstep, register him, because we are busy reconciling his account. Don't delay his registration because NSFAS is catching up. And then, of course, the appeals process. Now, a lot of the issues that we deal with is because we get insufficient information from students. So we can't, for instance, process your application if you don't provide us with a consent form that we check your credit record. And so we have to go back to students often, on and on again. The other issue is students don't sign their bursary agreements. And then, I can't just keep on paying because the Auditor General is going to be very angry with me just dishing out money to a student that hasn't signed his thing. And we have done several outreach programs together with the student leadership. We've got an excellent relationship with SAWS. They actually do a lot of the work for us on the ground. And, of course, with the institutions. But we can't keep on doing this. So this year we're going to work with the Department of Basic Education to introduce NSFAS into their guidance so that they can guide students already from February, March onwards.
Matriculants, that is. So they're familiar with what...
they're familiar with the rules. They know how to apply. They know which documents to provide. Well, that's what we're trying to do to ease the situation.
We'll look at the history of NSFAS and what you still have to deal with and the impact on the life of a university or TVET college student. I'm talking to Dr. Randall Carolissen. He is the administrator of NSFAS. Don't go away. We will be picking up on the issues that I mentioned.